What is an angler to do when they know they need to work on their casting, but they can't always hit the river? I've got 5 tips, lad, that I assembled that I think are going to help improve your fly casting. You need to slow down and listen to the rod. Now, I don't mean this in some kind of like far out, like, listen to the rod, dude, kind of attitude. That's not where I'm coming at it from. So on your final cast, if you drive that rod tip really far forward and you drive it all the way down so that the tip of the rod is actually pointing down towards the water instead of above it or at least parallel with it, that's when you're going to run into that issue of all your fly lines just piling up in front of you. Almost every fly casting instructor repeated this as an important way to become a better fly caster. So I reckon it is pretty important. It's going to be number 1 on our list as well. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant, back at it for yet another week of excellence in fly fishing broadcasting. And this week, we are going to be talking all about some tips to improve your fly casting. This topic, as most of them are, was generated from one of our listeners, Lad from Utah, sent in a question, and he said, I recently took a guided trip to the Green River. It was a great experience. I caught a personal best brown on none other than the bounce rig. I call BS on that, my friend. Bounce rig doesn't catch fish. No, it does. Of course it does. Alex catches fish on it all the time. Back to Lad's question. He says, I did spend some time streamer fishing and dry fly fishing, which pointed out how bad I need to improve my casting abilities. That being said, do you have any drills or techniques you recommend I can practice to improve my casting abilities? Well, my first inclination to help you improve your casting abilities is just to tell you to go to the water more, get out fishing more, because you'll improve your casting with the more time that you spend on the water. But that's kind of tongue in cheek, right? I understand it is a lot easier said than done to go fishing more often. I mean, I used to fish 250 days a year. Now I'm lucky to break 150. I get it. That's just reality. It's tough to get out all the time that you want to. So what is an angler to do when they know they need to work on their casting, but they can't always hit the river? Well, I combed through quite a few articles, videos on this topic. I consulted with the fly fishing gurus over in the Far East. They don't even use a fly rod to cast. They just do it all with their hands. That's a joke for those of you in Rio Linda. No, I did go through, though, and I tried to find a bunch of really good stuff that would help. These aren't just tips that I'm like, oh, I think this is going to help you. This is stuff that people who are expert casters recommend. I would never consider myself to be like a championship level caster. I can put my fly where I want it. And to me, that's the definition of a good fly caster, is if you can put your fly where you want it, like 90% of the time, you're doing pretty well. That's about where I put myself. I get my flies there maybe 90% of the time on a good day. If I've had my Diet Coke, it's definitely 90. If I'm forced to drink that Coke Zero or Mountain Dew Zero or whatever Alex brings on the trip that is not Diet Coke, then my accuracy drops, and it gets even worse if he didn't feed me wings the night before. And anyways, I've got 5 tips, lad, that I assembled that I think are going to help improve your fly casting. So tip number 1, you need to slow down and listen to the rod. Now, I don't mean this in some kind of like far out, like, listen to the rod, dude, kind of attitude. That's not where I'm coming at it from. I did list this one first, though, because almost every fly casting instructor repeated this as an important way to become a better fly caster. So I reckon it is pretty important. It's going to be number 1 on our list as well. Most of the problems that I see folks having with their fly cast is that they're always trying to move the rod too quickly. They're trying to move it too fast. Even if you have that fast action fly rod, your fly cast still is a pretty relaxed motion. I mean, if you're chasing pike and muskie, if you're saltwater fly fishing, there's a bit more work that goes into it. But for trout, bass, panfish, even carp, there's not a whole lot of work that goes into the fly cast, at least from a physical standpoint. You shouldn't be wearing yourself out, like just going ham. You're not hammering nails in all day with your fly cast. That's kind of the same motion that you're doing, but you're not actually hammering anything. So anyways, back to the main point of this topic here. If you listen to the fly rod, the rod will tell you when to move your cast forward or backward, because the load of the line will come off the rod. You'll actually feel the rod. It'll get just a tiny bit lighter. And that tells you that your fly line has unfurled and it is completely straight. That's when you move the rod to the next stage of your casting stroke. That's how you get those really nice, crispy looking loops that's just going to unfurl out there, be the envy of everybody on Instagram. That's how you do it, is by listening to the rod. Now, don't be afraid if you're having a hard time feeling that moment. Do not be afraid to look at your rod, especially on your back cast. You should be able to see it on your front cast, but especially on your back cast, don't be afraid to look at it, watch the line throughout the entire cast. You will start to feel the moment that it's straightened out, and you'll begin to feel what that feels like for your fly rod. And once you've watched enough, you're going to start to feel that without needing to watch the line. And this is a lot of why I actually prefer fishing with bamboo fly rods, because, not just bamboo fly rods, it's slower action fly rods, because I can feel the load of the line so well. The first time I ever fished with bamboo, I was amazed at how long it took for the line to straighten out all the way behind me and then push the rod forward and it straightened out again, especially compared to a really fast action fly rod like we've got today. It was a completely different sport. And that's why I prefer the slower action rods, because I can feel the line coming off of them so well. I get so much feedback from the rod. So pay attention to your rod. That's going to help no matter what, even if you're just practice casting or if you are out on the water fishing. Pay attention to what your rod's telling you. That is going to help you immensely with improving your casting and your accuracy. So do that. Tip number 2, film yourself. Now, I know this might sound a little off the wall, but bear with me. It can do wonders. If you're out there and you're like, dude, I'm casting, I'm doing everything that Spencer tells me to do on Untangled, but it still ain't working. I don't know what the problem is. Well, all of us, I reckon just about all of us, have a fancy little camera in our pockets. I've got one right now. I think all of us do. Set it up and film your cast. Go to a park, start casting, film it, and then compare that to casting videos on YouTube that show you what proper casting form should look like. We actually happen to have one, as luck would have it. It's in our beginner fly fishing masterclass. I'll drop a link to that in the podcast description so that you can go watch that once you're finished listening to this show. But in all seriousness, kidding aside, filming yourself casting can help you see if you're bringing the rod too far back, or if you're bringing it too far forward, or if you're snapping your wrist too much, or if you're not waiting long enough on each casting stroke. It's really helpful because it allows you to see what you might be doing wrong, and then you're able to correct that the next time you go out to fish or the next time you go out to practice. Yeah, it just really is a helpful way to do things. All right, tip number 3. Third thing you can do here is aim for targets. Set up targets somewhere. Paper plates are a pretty common option. Hula hoops also get used quite a bit. I've known this to help some people. So if it does sound like it'll help you, then I recommend using it. You can set up targets even on your lawn if you have one. And this is where, like, when you're practicing your casting, don't worry so much about the distance. that you're trying to get. Like, don't go out there and try and shoot for landing everything perfectly at 70 feet, because how often when you're trout fishing do you need a 70-foot cast? Most of our trout fishing happens in that 30 to 50 foot zone. So focus on those casts from 30 to 50 feet, dial that in, and then when you do need to punch things out to 60, 70, maybe even 80 feet, in those rare instances, you've already got the fundamentals, and it's just one more haul, one more cast, one more false cast to get the line out there, and you'll be good. So when you are setting up these targets, if you have a lawn, you're like, well, my lawn's not big enough. Well, it probably is if you've got 30-ish feet of lawn. I mean, I haven't measured my lawn, but I think I've got 30-ish feet of lawn either in the front or the back here. I know not all of us have lawn space, but even if you go to a park, you don't need like this huge swath of the park all to yourself. Find, 30 to 60 feet, set up in that zone, 30 to 50 feet, put your targets down, and try to land your fly right on them. Aim for getting your fly on them 9 times out of 10. I like using a paper plate because it's really easy to see if I landed on the target or not, but a hula hoop works just fine as well. This is going to help you dial in your accuracy, which is nice. And just want to make sure I've got quite the list here for y'all. So I want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything as I'm going through this. Aiming for targets is definitely going to help. And this does bring us though to the fourth part of, or my fourth tip, which is when you practice your casting. If you're not out on the river practicing, if you're on the lawn at a park somewhere, always tie something onto the end of the leader when you practice your casting. This helps your leader straighten out just like it will when you're out there with an actual fly. And a lot of folks will just tie their leader around a piece of yarn. You don't need a hook, but you do need something that will help the leader unroll it efficiently. It also helps you see with your accuracy as well, so you know exactly where your fly would be landing if you actually had a fly on there. It's just, you want to make sure you've got that piece of yarn. Like I said, just literally just do like an overhand knot over a piece of yarn. You'll be fine. It does not need to be anything fancy, but make sure that you have something on the end of your leader when you practice your casting, so that you're able to see where it's all landing. And again, it's going to give you a more natural lay down of the fly line. In fact, I was just, I review a lot of fly rods for Midcurrent and Hatch Magazine, as well as all the wonderful stuff I get to do here at Ventures. And I was just playing around with the new Orvis Helios. And I remember when I got that, I got it probably a month before launch, and I had it out just in my backyard. And I didn't put anything on the leader, and I was just casting out there, and it felt great, but it did cast different when I actually had a fly on the end of it versus when I was just throwing a bare leader. It was enough of a difference that I felt it. So you do want to make sure you've got that on there. I hope I stressed that enough. Now, tip number 5, okay, because 3 and 4 kind of ran into each other there, but tip number 5, and this is, I mean, I know I said listening to the rod was really important, and I stand by that because listening to the rod is incredibly important. But I think this is just as important. Listening to the rod's 1A and this is 1B, or maybe like 1A.1. It's right, neck and neck. And that is to keep the rod tip moving in a straight line. During the fly cast, your rod tip should not be moving in an arc. If you're watching the YouTube podcast, I'm making like a rainbow here. Your rod tip should not be moving in a rainbow formation. It should stay in a nice straight line. That is going to get you the most accuracy and power out of your cast, because that's going to create tighter loops. Tighter loops are more accurate than big, open, wide loops. So the tighter your loop, the more accurate your fly cast is going to be. You also don't want your rod tip moving side to side either. So you want it going in a straight line, but you don't want to make like an oval over the top of your head. We actually have a casting video, like I mentioned, and we've got a clip from our casting video that shows us well. And for those of you watching the video podcast, I'll have this inserted into the episode so that you can see what I mean. If we're looking at it from a bird's eye view, you do not want that rod tip to travel in an oval. You want it to travel in a straight line from a bird's eye view. And then if you're down just, at our level and you're looking at the rod, you don't want your rod tip moving left to right either. You want it moving in a nice straight line, as straight as possible. That is going to net you the most accurate cast you can possibly coax out of that fly rod. And interestingly enough, this is one of the places where fly rod companies are making a lot of innovations right now. I was actually able to speak with the folks at Orvis who developed their new Helios, and one of the things they focused on was getting that tip to stay in as straight a line as possible, because if you can engineer the rod so that the tip doesn't move too much during the cast, that's going to make the rod inherently more accurate. Accuracy is largely up to the angler, but if you can eliminate a lot of those variables in the fly rod itself so the tip moves in a nice straight line, you're going to make a more accurate fly rod too. So bear that in mind. Your tip needs to be moving in a nice straight line. You do not want your rod tip on your front cast to start low and really, really high on your back cast, or vice versa, because that's going to create that arc shape that I mentioned earlier. Instead, you want to focus on getting that rod tip to travel on the same plane on both your front and your back cast. That should be your goal. When you do this, again, you're going to generate those tighter loops of fly line, and tighter loops are way more accurate. One final tip here as well. If you notice that when you put your final cast out to lay your fly down, so you've made 1 or 2 false casts and you're getting ready to lay your fly down, and you put your rod, and all your line just like falls in a giant pile of spaghetti right in front of you, and it looks awful, and you're like, what did I do wrong? Well, that's likely because you pushed the tip of the rod just a bit too far forward. You took it off that straight line and you curved it down low, and that wrecks the entire cast. You want your final cast to end high, just as it does during your false casting. You end that cast high, you keep the rod tip moving in a nice straight line, and you'll be in business. Now, I'm going to add a little bit of a caveat to this, because I wrote the script for this episode. And when I say I wrote the script, I try to write down all my thoughts so I make sure I don't forget to go over anything. So when I wrote down this tip number 5, I went fishing the next day, and I was actually paying attention to where my rod tip ended on my cast, because I got lucky. I was in the middle of a good blue wing hatch. And yeah, I know it's February. I was fishing blue wings. It was amazing. We've had a wonderful little bit of a spring here. Anyways, I was noticing that I was dropping my rod tip a little bit lower than I necessarily thought, because, you hear all the time, and I think even in our casting video we teach, you want the rod tip to move between 10 and 2 on a clock face. So your rod tip should be ending at about 2 o'clock on the front cast, and then your line's going to unfurl and it's going to roll out real nice on the water. Well, I noticed that when I was out fishing right after I wrote all this down, that my rod tip was ending more at like 3 o'clock. It was almost straight out in front of me. And I was still getting my flies to lay out where they were. So I was trying to analyze that and think, okay, well, I'm telling people to do one thing and I'm out here doing another. I'm having a different experience. And what I concluded is that I was still moving that rod in a straighter line. I was bringing the rod tip down just a little bit on that final cast. I wasn't bringing it and like dipping it straight down to like 5 o'clock. That's the thing that I'm trying to tell you guys to avoid. So on your final cast, if you drive that rod tip really far forward and you drive it all the way down so that the tip of the rod is actually pointing down towards the water instead of above it, or at least parallel with it, that's when you're going to run into that issue of all your fly lines just piling up in front of you. So it doesn't need to be super high. I'm not telling you, and your fly cast really high, because if you do that, you are going to end up with not as much distance sometimes, just depending on where your fly casting abilities are at. So, and I hope I've made this clear, but your rod tip should end either still pointing above the water or at the very, very least parallel with the water. And if you do that, you should avoid that nasty mess where your line just lands in a giant puddle in front of you, and then you look like you don't know what you're doing, and nobody wants to look like that random clown out on the river who doesn't have a clue what they're doing. And with that, folks, hopefully that answers some questions that you've had about casting, about fly casting. And Lad, who sent that question, Lad from Utah, I hope that gives you some actionable tips to use to help improve your fly casting. And with that, the main portion of our show is wrapped up, and we are ready to jump into the Q&A portion of the show. We've got a ton of interesting stuff in the last half of the show. You do not want to miss this. We're going to talk about how to fix broken fly rods, how to pick your next fly rod, tips for fly fishing during colder weather, and why fly line might slap your rod. So stay tuned for answers on all of that. Get comfortable and get ready for the Q&A portion of this week's show. Marvin from Missouri is going to lead us off this week with his question. He writes in and says, "Thanks for your podcast. Always learning something. No trout near me." I'm sorry to hear that, Marvin. But I really go after the panfish, bass, and an occasional catfish. Question 1. What are the reasons that would cause a fly line to slap into your rod? What a mess. Also, what are the main reasons that would cause a fly rod to break? I have, for some reason, broken the tips off 2 fly rods, both Reddington Path 9-foot 5 weights. One about 4 inches and one about 6 or 8 inches. Broke one when stringing it up by haphazardly pulling the line to the side just after going through the tip eye. One lesson learned. The other, I was just landing a good-sized bluegill. I think they are considered fast-action rods. I repaired one with the eye of a large safety pin, sticking one piece into the rod and the other leg alongside of the rod, if you can picture that. The other tip I replaced by cutting the broken piece short enough to fit into the end of the shaft, at least an inch or two. Both were glued with epoxy glue. When dried, I used Lume Solares UV to smooth it out a little more. Seems to work, but the question is, how does this affect the action of the rod? Does it really matter? Called about a replacement rod end piece, but are on back order till December. Marvin, really great questions. Thank you for sending these ones in. Let's dive on into them. So, first one, and this follows up on our fly casting discussion from the beginning of the show, so thank you. The reason that your fly line slaps your rod is that you are not letting the line straighten completely behind you during the back cast. If you move the rod forward into the front cast too soon, the line will pile up and hit the rod. I actually broke a rod doing this once. I was fishing a Winston, a Winston Nexus. That's an old, not too old. They don't make it anymore. But it was one of their mid-priced rods back. Winston used to do that. They used to have some mid-priced rods for like $500-ish bucks, I think. Anyways, I was fishing this with a big old mouse pattern, and I remember it was mostly dark, and I was throwing this cast, and I pushed my cast forward, and the mouse, I can hear it like whistling through the air because it was so big, and I hit the tip of the fly rod, and the rod kind of made this like boing sound, and then it didn't feel right after that, and I was like, but I just kept fishing it because it was dark, and I was like, oh, I don't know what's going on. But the rod just kept feeling really funny. So finally I was like, all right, I got to check this out. So I turned my headlamp on because it was dark. I was fishing mice, and I look, and I busted the tip of that rod like, probably 10 inches down from the tip. And I felt awful about it. Because Winston had sent it to me for a review, and then I had to call him and say, hey, I broke your rod, which is never a fun conversation to have. But it actually broke because that mouse, your flies are actually traveling pretty fast during a fly cast, believe it or not. They're moving. I remember reading somewhere, and I have no idea how accurate this is, so please don't hold me to this, but I remember reading somewhere that your flies are moving like around 60 miles an hour during your fly cast. That sounds really ridiculous, but I remember reading that somewhere. And even if it's half true, if they're moving 30 miles an hour, if you've got a big old fly moving that quick and it hits your rod, yeah, that's going to break, especially the tip of the rod because it's such a delicate part of the rod. this is actually one of the most common reasons that fly rods break, is hitting them with flies or heavy nymph rigs and split shot on poorly timed casts. So, and speaking of why fly rods break, we are going to be doing an episode coming up. I don't know exactly when. I've got the interview scheduled, but I don't know exactly when it's going to post. We're looking April, probably, about why fly rods break, and we're doing that with a fly rod engineer. So you do not want to miss that episode of the show. And I'll be promoting that when it comes up later, of course. But just to let you know, we've got that in the works. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm excited for that one. But anyways, you don't want your fly line to slap your rod, because that means that you could be hitting it with your flies. And if you're doing that, that is a very common reason that your fly rod is going to break. So, and that really is actually one of the main reasons that they break, because of our mistakes, either poorly timed casts or the car door issue. Usually we're stressing the rods in ways that we don't really think about would stress them, like if we're bending them too much, or if we're picking the rod up by like the middle part instead of down by the butt. Any of those things that put stress that the rod wasn't designed to handle can actually weaken it, and then over time it can eventually end up snapping. That's not terribly uncommon to see happen. Usually it's because of our mistakes. Fly rods don't break due to manufacturing defects nearly as much as most anglers think they do. It's usually something that we did and we didn't even notice. I mean, just the other day I was out fishing and I fell. I was with Alex, actually, and we're in the river, and I slipped and I fell and I ate it. I filled my waders up with water, and so I was freezing, and I banged my rod real hard on the rock, and I remember looking at it, and it's got a pretty big ding in the finish in the butt section. I'm like, well, shoot, this rod might, I hit it hard enough to ding it, and I'm like, oh, I wouldn't be surprised if the butt section breaks at some point because I fell on it that hard. And even though there's no visible cracks, there's just the ding, and it just looks like a chip in the finish, I wouldn't be surprised to see it break, because, again, a fly rod's not meant to take, 225 pounds of stumbling angler falling on it. That's just not what they were designed to do. Oh, well, and as to your last question, Marvin, the last few inches of the fly rod, they are important to the taper. Every part of the taper of the fly rod matters. What you're going to notice is that without the end of your tip section, you're going to have a harder time landing your flies as softly on the water as you can with a complete rod. You're also going to lose some of that tipper protection that your soft tip provides. So if you're fishing with, let's say, maybe 6X or something really light and you hook into a big fish, there's less of the light rod to absorb the shock, and you're more likely to break the fish off. In fact, my wife bought me an antique. I collect some antique fly rods, and she bought me an antique Winston. It's an 8'5" weight, but the tip had broken like an inch down. So it's like a 7'11" 5 weight. And whoever had owned the rod before me just stuck a new tip top on, wrapped some new thread around it, and put some epoxy on it and called it good. And even though it's only like an inch shorter, I can tell that it's not quite right. I love the rod. It still casts wonderful, but I can tell it's just not quite right. I've cast other 8'5" weights at Winston's built, and mine just feels just a little bit different because the tip's not complete. Now, I'm not saying everybody's going to notice that. I do review fly rods for that. That's part of my living, so I do notice those things probably a little bit more than the average angler. And I'm not saying that what you did here is wrong or that it's going to ruin your fly rod. I'm just saying that I wouldn't bank on that as a permanent fix for your problem, because you're putting stress on parts of the rod in ways that maybe they weren't designed to bend or flex that way. So you might end up breaking even more of the rod that way. What usually happens if you bust the tip of the rod is that you just fit a new tip top onto the broken end, because that keeps the integrity of the rod together. Again, that's what happened with the Winston that I just talked about. It keeps that rod fishable and usable and doesn't run the risk of further damaging the rod in the way that it sounds like a couple of your fixes did there, Marvin. So I would just wait it out for your replacement parts. This is also why we sell our Fly Flinger with 2 tip sections, so that if one breaks, you can keep fishing while we get you another tip section. So if you're interested, Marvin, I will link our Fly Flinger in the show notes so you can take a look at it. Maybe you can pick up an extra 5 weight. We do have an updated version of it coming soon. It's going to be a sleek, sexy fish catching machine, so you do not want to miss out on picking up one of those Fly Flingers. Appreciate the question, Marvin. Thank you so much. Yeah, appreciate you sending that in. Gary from Nebraska has our next question. He writes in and says, I started fly fishing earlier this year. Yes, you can fly fish in Omaha. I mostly fish for largemouth bass, panfish, and crappie, but Nebraska Game and Parks established some new ponds that started some smallmouth and yellow perch. I started with a 9-foot 5-weight rod combo from Orvis and love it. I added a 9-foot 8-weight rod combo from TFO to cast some bigger bass poppers in our Nebraska winds, and it works well too. I use nymphs, wet flies, and streamers mostly, and some hopper-dropper combos. I started tying flies too. After all the background info, my question is, what should my next fly rod be? I know I'm hooked, and I regret that I didn't start fly fishing years ago. Absolutely love it. I don't want to spend a stupid amount of money, but I'm ready to make an investment in this wonderful pastime. When I'm out there on the bank of a pond or lake, I'm in my zen moment. Love the podcast and the fly fishing community in general. There are so many helpful people that love to share. By the way, forget Diet Coke, Coke Zero, Diet Pepsi. Snapple Peach Tea goes great with buffalo wings if beer is unavailable. Just saying, go Huskers. So Gary from Nebraska writes that in. And Gary, I'm going to tip my hat to you for being a Huskers fan, man. That is it's a rough go of it for a while. So you're not really close to any trout fishing that I know of, although I'm sure there's some trout fishing around you. You're a ways from the driftless region, which has some really great trout fishing, actually, and you're also a ways from Colorado or Wyoming, where there's plenty of really good trout fishing as well. So I don't know that I would focus on a trout rod for your next rod. If I were you, given that you talk a lot about fishing lakes and ponds, I would suggest picking up a 6-weight. I'll tell you why. It is a lot less rod than your 8-weight. I use an 8-weight when I'm fishing for sockeye salmon in Alaska, for example. They're big game rods. So if it's moderately windy, your 6-weight is going to handle things better than your 5-weight will, but without that big game power of your 8-weight. A lot of folks are fishing 8-weights for salmon and pike as well. The 6-weight is also light and versatile enough that you could use it for trout fishing as well, if you don't want to bring your 5-weight along for that. The 6-weight has also got plenty of backbone for bass as well. It's actually really great for carp. I don't know if you have that much carp fishing nearby, but you probably do, because a lot of us have a lot more carp fishing nearby than we ever realized. And the 6-weight has the backbone to land carp, but it'll be a bit more delicate when presenting some of the smaller carp flies. Carp are actually pretty spooky critters if you mess up the cast, so a light presentation is often required. But a 5-weight can be a little bit too soft of a rod sometimes if you hook into the real big carp. That 6-weight really kind of hits your sweet spot for bass, carp, even some pike fishing, and trout. So that's what I'd go with, Gary, and I really appreciate you sending that question on in. Micah from Utah's got our next question, and he says, hey, Spencer, I've been listening to the podcast for several months now, and it has got me even more excited about fly fishing than I already was, if possible. I have a goal to go fishing at least once a week next year, and I'm wondering what tips you have for cold weather fly fishing. Being in Utah, winters get intense, and I haven't ever had too much success fly fishing the rivers here after the snow flies. Any tips would be great. P.S. I'm a cherry Coke guy. If I'm drinking soda, I'm going for the full sugar stuff. Well, Micah, my wife would agree with you on that. She will not, if she wants a soda and all I've got is Diet Coke, she won't drink it. So I think you guys are on the same page there. Now, I don't want to hear it about winters being intense in Utah. I grew up there, all right, and I live in Wyoming now. We got real winters here in Wyoming, okay? Utah's got nothing on Wyoming winters. Oh, I kid. I know it can get cold back home. So, tips for fly fishing in the cold weather. Well, I actually just did an entire podcast episode about winter fly fishing. I'll link that in the show notes so you can take a look at that. But there are some general tips that are worth remembering, not just for fly fishing in the winter, but this is February now. We're getting into early spring fishing, and a lot of the same tips that apply for winter fly fishing are going to apply to your early spring fly fishing as well. So I wanted to go over some of those with you. There's three main tips I'm going to share that whenever it's cold, I think I don't know what we'll define cold as, like below 40 degrees, probably below 40 degrees. If it's cold outside, these are the three things that I think apply to all cold weather fly fishing. First thing you got to remember is that the fish are in different spots than they were in the summer. This is probably the most important part of it, because a lot of anglers will try to fish the same water all year round without realizing that even on a tailwater, fish are going to move out of the shallow riffles and shallow runs into the deeper pools and runs. They go to those deeper pools and runs to conserve energy because the colder water slows down their metabolism. There's also not as much bug activity, so they don't want to spend as much energy chasing down food because the food that's available is often a lot smaller and there's not as much of it. So they prefer to hang out where they don't have to fight the current as much, but still have a decent chance at getting a lot of food. You want slower, deeper water this time of year. The seams between fast and slow water will be very productive as well. The same thing with eddies, even more than they usually are. Alex and I actually were just out a couple weeks ago, and we noticed this play out for us. We were fishing, and all the fish we hooked were in the slow, deep water. So it bears out that's just where you want to look for your fish. Every now and then you'll find them in weird spots in the colder months of the year, but that slower, deeper water is going to be your best friend this time of year. So the second thing to remember with cold weather fishing for trout is you need to understand their diet. Fish are going to be keyed in on midges for the most part, along with scuds during the winter. Egg patterns are going to produce if there are fall spawning fish, but you obviously want to avoid stepping on any reds that you still see visible. In the spring, you might start seeing early season mayfly hatches. You might even find some small black stoneflies as well. So have those patterns handy and watch for fish poking around the surface. They'll start to do it, and it's a lot of fun. Chances are there's a midge or a mayfly hatch going on if you see them poking up. So you do want those flies handy. And I just want to reiterate real quick that I mentioned just a second ago, Alex and I were out fishing a few weeks ago, and Alex was he whipped my butt. He caught like 6 fish and I caught 2 or something. And he caught all of his, I think every one of them on an egg pattern. And this was in late January. So the brown trout were done spawning. The spring spawning rainbows hadn't started yet, but the egg patterns, I mean, fish are used to seeing those, especially in the colder months of the year. They're high protein. They'll move for them. They just love egg patterns. So that's a really good one that I would suggest fishing during the winter, because that'll get them to move. If you have an egg and a midge, it's a pretty solid cold weather combo there. All right, and then the last thing you got to remember about fly fishing when it's cold outside is you got to understand how to stay warm. You got to layer up. I can't tell you how much I love wearing wool when I'm out there on the water this time of year. I wear wool socks. I've got a wool base layer, and then I wear wool pants over that. And that's all I need to stay warm, even in winter here in Wyoming. Wool is just fantastic. It's the best stuff. I love it. The stuff that I actually use, I wear the Thermo 350 pants from Squala. I love those ones. They're my personal favorites. I highly recommend them. If you don't have wool, fleece is a really good option as well. You can just wear your fleece pajama pants. I used to do that all the time because I was too cheap to buy the wool, and then I bought the wool and my world changed. So I'd recommend buying the wool if you could. Then make sure you've got a good insulating layer on your chest, and pack along a rain jacket, because even if it's not raining, the rain jackets are really good at cutting wind, and that can really help you from freezing up out there on the water. Even a light wind when it's 30 outside can make it just miserable. So make sure you layer up. You've got good stuff, good gear, and you'll be set. Hopefully that helps. If you've got other questions, go listen to that podcast episode I did, or shoot us an email, and I would be glad to answer them. And folks, that does it for this week's episode of Untangled. That wraps it up. I am so stoked that y'all were here for this episode. I really appreciate it. All of us here at VFC do. I love the fact that I get to be here and to do this show. And if you have a question that you would like answered about fly fishing, we do the Q&A section every week. The beginning part of this show is always based off a question I get from you guys. So please send those questions in. There's always a link in the podcast description. And then if you could, please and thank you, rate this show wherever you're listening to it. 5 stars is acceptable, I would hope. I think we're putting out a 5-star production here. And subscribe to it. That helps more people see the show. The ratings and more subscribers we get helps more people see the show, helps more people discover what we're doing here. And if you're listening to this all the way through here, hopefully you like it and you want more people to get the help as well. So if you could do that, that would be great. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water if you can. Enjoy yourself and tie lines.